The first time I saw blood on our front walkway, it wasn't from a fight or a car accident or anything dramatic like that, which somehow made it worse, because it meant someone had been hurt quietly, carefully, in the kind of way you only notice when the sun hits the concrete at the wrong angle and your stomach decides it knows something your brain refuses to accept. And when I bent down with a tissue and touched the dark smear, my fingers came away rusty and sticky and real. I stood there barefoot in my school socks, my backpack slipping off one shoulder, staring at our neighbor's door across the narrow strip of lawn, the one I'd been trained to avoid the way kids learn to avoid a barking dog, even though no one ever said the words out loud, because in our house the rule wasn't spoken. It was breathed. It was passed in glances and sudden silences. It was my mother grabbing my wrist too hard when I stepped too close to the fence and saying, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, that I should come inside because it was getting late. His name was Marco Klein, and the neighborhood treated him like a storm cloud that might or might not break. And I had grown up believing he was dangerous the way you believe in gravity, not because you understand it, but because you've been warned not to test it. And yet there he was every morning, leaving before dawn in work boots, lunch pail, the tired posture of a man who doesn't expect anything good from the day, but shows up anyway. My mother's car screeched into the driveway like she'd been speeding the whole way from wherever she'd gone, and she saw the blood before she saw me, because her face changed in a way that made my throat tighten, like all the air in the afternoon had been borrowed and suddenly needed to be paid back. She grabbed my shoulders, turned me away from the stain, and started scrubbing at it with a wet rag so fast it looked like she was trying to erase time itself. And when my father stepped out behind her, still wearing his work badge, he didn't ask what happened. He didn't even look confused. He just went rigid, staring at Marco's door as if he expected it to open and swallow us. I tried to keep my voice steady because I was 15 and tired of being treated like a piece of glass that might break if someone tells me the truth. "Mom, what is that?" I asked, and she kept scrubbing, her jaw clenched so hard it trembled, and she said it was probably from an animal, or a cut, or something messy from the trash. And my father snapped my name like a warning siren, the way he only did when he wanted to end a conversation without answering it. "Lena, go inside," he said, and I didn't, because I was done going inside to make their fear easier to manage. That night at dinner, my parents spoke too softly and laughed too quickly, and every time I looked toward the window that faced Marco's house, my mother's fork would pause mid-air like she could feel my thoughts moving, and when I finally said what had been pressing on my tongue all day, the room went so quiet I could hear the refrigerator hum. "You've always acted like he was going to hurt me," I said, watching my father's knuckles whiten around his glass, watching my mother's smile collapse into something almost pleading. "You won't tell me why, and now there's blood outside, and you want me to pretend it's nothing, and I'm not little anymore. So either tell me the truth, or I'm going to ask him myself." My mother made a sound like she'd been struck, and my father pushed his chair back with a scrape that felt like a door slamming. "You will not go near that man," he said, and the anger in his voice wasn't protective the way fathers in movies get. It was panicked, like he was terrified of a sentence being finished. I stared at both of them, at the tightness around their eyes, at the way my mother's hand trembled as she reached for the salt and missed it, and something in me hardened into a decision that didn't feel brave so much as necessary, because the unknown had been living in our house longer than I had. "Then I'll go now," I said, standing so fast my chair tipped back, and when my mother lunged to stop me, I was already moving, already pulling on my hoodie, already hearing my father's voice crack as he said my name again, But it was too late, because I had crossed the yard in 3 long strides, and before I could change my mind, my fist rose and knocked on Marco Klein's door, and the sound was louder than it had any right to be, as if the whole neighborhood had been waiting for someone to do exactly this. The door opened so quietly it felt like it had been expecting my knock, and Marco Klein stood there in a plain gray shirt with a smear of sawdust across his shoulder, his hands rough and stained the way my father's got when he fixed things around the house. And for a second, my mind stuttered, because the man in front of me didn't match the monster I'd been raised to imagine. He wasn't towering, he wasn't sneering, he wasn't holding anything sharp, and his eyes weren't wild at all. They were tired and steady, and when he looked at me, it wasn't like a stranger seeing a kid. It was like someone recognizing a face from a photograph they'd kept too long. "Lena," he said, and my stomach turned over hard because I had not told him my name, and behind me, the front door of my house banged open so loudly it made me flinch, and my father's voice shot across the yard like a thrown stone. "Get away from that door!" he yelled, and my mother's footsteps followed, fast and uneven, like she was running through a dream she couldn't wake up from. Marco didn't move aside, and he didn't step toward me either, which somehow made him scarier than if he'd done something obvious. He just watched my parents sprint across the grass, watched my mother's face go pale as paper, watched my father's anger swell into something bigger and uglier than anger, and then Marco's gaze dropped to my hands, to the way my fingers had curled into fists without me noticing. "I told myself I wouldn't say it unless you came on your own," he said quietly, and my mother made a sound that wasn't a word but had grief inside it. "Marco, don't," she whispered, as if she were speaking to a gun, and my father reached me and yanked my arm so hard my shoulder popped, not injured, but close enough to make my eyes sting with sudden tears. "Inside," he growled, dragging me backward, and I twisted free with a force that surprised me because I wasn't strong, not really, but I was desperate, and that does something to a person. "He knows my name," I said, pointing at Marco like I could pin the truth to him and keep it from running away. "Why does he know my name?" My father's face flushed dark red, and for a second I thought he might lunge at Marco, but it was my mother who stepped forward first, her hands lifted like she could hold the air between them and keep it from breaking. "Please," she said to Marco, and her voice sounded like it did when my grandma died, and she had to tell me gently, as if the wrong tone could shatter me. Marco's mouth tightened, like he'd been holding something back for years, and it was finally clawing at his throat. "She deserves to know," he said, and my father snapped, "You don't get to decide what she deserves." And Marco's eyes hardened at that, not with violence, but with a kind of flat certainty that made my skin prickle. "I've been deciding nothing," he said. "I've been waiting." He looked at me again, and his voice softened just enough to sound dangerous in a different way. "Your mother and we were together before she was with him," he said, nodding toward my father without even looking at him, as if my father was a detail he refused to respect. "It wasn't a high school crush. It was real, and it was forbidden, and it got punished." The word forbidden struck me like a slap, because it wasn't romantic the way books make it. It sounded like something legal, something stained, something that ends in people lowering their voices and locking doors. My mother shook her head rapidly, tears already collecting at the corners of her eyes, and my father's hand closed around my wrist again, tighter this time, like he could squeeze the story out of my bones. "Stop," my father said, and his voice cracked on the edge of it, and I realized with a cold shock that he wasn't angry because I was unsafe. He was angry because he was exposed. Marco took a slow breath, as if choosing each word like it could cost him something. "We planned to leave," he said. "We had money hidden, documents ready, a place lined up in another town, and then your father found out." My mother made a strangled sound, her shoulders curling inward, and my father stepped toward Marco with murder in his face. "You're lying," he spat, but his eyes were too sharp, too terrified, and it made the word lie sound weak. Marco didn't flinch. "I'm not," he said, and then he did something that changed the whole scene, something so small and controlled that it made my heart start pounding harder than if he'd shouted. He reached into the pocket of his shirt, slowly, deliberately, and pulled out a folded envelope that looked old enough to have lived through a dozen summers, and he held it out toward me like an offering. "This is why your parents never let you near my door," he said, his voice low, almost sorrowful. "Because your mother wrote this, and your father knows what's in it, and if you read it, you'll understand why he's been afraid of me for 15 years. My father lunged, trying to snatch the envelope, and my mother grabbed his arm, crying, begging him to stop, and the three of them looked like a photograph of a disaster mid-frame. But I moved faster than any of them expected, and I took the envelope from Marco's hand, feeling the rough paper under my fingertips, feeling the weight of something that had waited in silence for longer than I'd been alive. "Lena, don't," my mother said, her voice breaking in half, and my father hissed, "If you open that, you can't close it again." And Marco said, almost gently, "That's the point." I stared at the envelope, at my mother's handwriting on the front, my name written there in a careful script that didn't look like a birthday card, and my throat tightened as I realized the truth had been addressed to me all along. Then my father did the one thing he'd never done in my entire life, the one thing that told me exactly how deep the secret went, because he didn't argue anymore. He didn't threaten. He didn't pretend. He simply grabbed for me with both hands and tried to force me back toward our house like I was a package he could return unopened. And the moment his fingers dug into my arms, I screamed, not from pain, but from fury. And the neighbor across the street opened her curtains, and another porch light clicked on, and suddenly the whole block felt awake, watching, and I realized with a sick, electric clarity that whatever happened next, my family would never be able to hide behind polite silence again. Everything broke open after that scream, not in a dramatic explosion, but in the slow, humiliating way secrets do when too many people are watching, and there's nowhere left to stand that isn't exposed, because my mother sank down onto the front step like her legs had simply given up on pretending, and my father let go of me as if the neighbor's eyes had finally burned his hands, and Marco stepped back just enough to give me space without retreating, which felt deliberate, like he was showing me that whatever choice I made next would be mine alone. The envelope trembled in my hands, not because I was scared of what it contained, but because some instinct deep in my chest already knew it would explain too much at once, and I hated that my life could be folded into a few yellowed pages. "If you read it out here, it will change things forever," my mother said, her voice hoarse and pleading, and when I looked at her, really looked, I saw not a villain or a victim, but a woman who had built an entire life on the hope that silence could harden into safety. Marco spoke then, softer than before, as if the volume itself mattered. "You don't have to read it now," he said. "You just have to know it exists, and that I didn't hurt anyone, no matter what you've been told." My father laughed, a sharp, broken sound that didn't carry any humor at all, and he wiped his face with his hand like he was smearing away sweat or guilt or both. "You think this makes you a hero," he said to Marco, his voice low and poisonous, "dragging up something that should have stayed buried." Marco didn't rise to it, didn't defend himself, and instead, he did something that surprised me more than the envelope ever could, because he turned and walked back into his house, leaving the door open behind him like an invitation that wasn't a demand. "Come inside," he said, not to my parents, but to me, and the simplicity of it felt like a rope being thrown across a widening gap. My mother shook her head frantically, whispering my name over and over like a prayer, and my father stepped forward again, but this time he didn't touch me, which felt like its own confession, because he knew that if he did, everyone watching would see it for what it was. I followed Marco inside, my legs unsteady but moving, carrying the envelope like it might burn through my skin if I hesitated too long. And his house was nothing like the dark cave I'd imagined growing up, because it smelled faintly of coffee and sawdust, and the furniture was worn but clean, and there were photographs on the walls that made my chest ache before I even understood why. He closed the door gently, shutting out my parents' voices, and for the first time since I knocked, the world felt quiet in a way that wasn't suffocating. "You can sit," he said, gesturing to a chair at the small kitchen table, and when I did, he didn't loom or pace or crowd me. He just leaned against the counter like a man bracing himself for weather he'd been tracking for years. "Your mother loved you before she ever held you," he said, and my throat tightened at the way he said it, not possessive, not bitter, just factual and sad. "She wrote that letter the night she decided to stay." I opened the envelope then, because there was no version of this where waiting would make it easier, and the paper inside was soft with age, creased and unfolded so many times it felt like fabric, and my mother's handwriting spilled across it in careful lines that shook more as the pages went on. She wrote about being young and trapped between expectations and fear, about loving two men in two very different ways, about discovering she was pregnant and realizing that choosing Marco meant choosing exile, disgrace, a life without the safety net my father could offer, and she wrote about my father's ultimatum, about the way love can be strangled by practicality until it stops breathing. She wrote that Marco wasn't dangerous, that he was patient and kind and willing to lose everything for her, and she wrote that my father promised stability, protection, and silence, and that silence had felt like mercy at the time. The last lines were the hardest, because she wrote them to me directly, apologizing for the fear I would inherit without understanding it, and admitting that she didn't know which man was my biological father, only that one would raise me, and the other would live close enough to watch me grow without being allowed to say why. I didn't realize I was crying until Marco slid a box of tissues across the table without comment, and when I finally looked up at him, my chest felt hollow and too full at the same time. "So, that's it," I said, my voice sounding far away even to me. "That's why." Marco nodded once, slow and deliberate. "Your father threatened to ruin us both if I ever spoke," he said. "He told me I'd be the dangerous man in the story, the one you'd be warned about, and I let him, because the alternative was tearing your life apart before you were even old enough to understand it." The realization hit me then, sharp and dizzying, because all my life I had believed danger wore a certain face, lived behind a certain door, and now I understood that the most dangerous thing in my world had been the lie I was protected by. My parents' voices rose outside, muffled but frantic, and Marco straightened, not with fear, but with resolve. "They'll want to control what happens next," he said quietly. "You don't have to let them." I folded the letter carefully and slid it back into the envelope. my hands steadier now than they'd been all day, and for the first time since childhood, I felt something click into place, because I wasn't choosing sides. I was choosing the truth, and whatever it cost, I knew I wouldn't be able to pretend again. The moment my parents forced their way inside Marco's house was the moment I understood that the truth didn't scare them nearly as much as losing control did, because my father didn't look at me first. He looked at the letter in my hands like it was a weapon, and my mother's eyes darted around the room as if she were searching for an exit that didn't exist anymore. The air felt tight, compressed, heavy with words that had waited too long to be spoken, and when my father finally spoke, his voice carried the brittle calm of someone standing at the edge of collapse, because he wasn't denying anything anymore. He was negotiating. He told me that people make mistakes, that families survive by choosing which truths to live with, that nothing good would come from pulling at a thread that had already been knotted into our lives. And as he talked, pacing in small, restless circles, I noticed how careful he was not to look at Marco, how he positioned himself between me and the door like habit alone had taught him where power was supposed to sit. Marco didn't interrupt him, didn't argue back, and the restraint in that silence was louder than anything my father said, because it forced the room to listen, to really hear the justifications stacked on top of fear and pride. And when my mother finally broke down, covering her face and sobbing that she had only wanted to protect me, the sound tore through me in a way that no accusation ever could. I stood there with the letter pressed against my chest, feeling the weight of years settle into something solid inside me. And when I spoke, my voice didn't shake the way I'd expected it to, because the confusion had burned itself out, leaving clarity behind. I told them that protection built on lies wasn't protection at all, that fear dressed up as care still teaches a child to be afraid of the wrong things, and that the dangerous man I'd been warned about was the only one in the room who had let me choose what to do with the truth. My father snapped then, the mask finally splitting, and he accused Marco of manipulation, of waiting like a vulture for the right moment to swoop in and claim something that wasn't his. And for the first time, Marco raised his voice, not in anger, but in resolve, telling him that love isn't ownership, and that watching a child grow from across a fence without being allowed to speak is not a victory. It's a sentence. The argument spiraled, voices overlapping, years of resentment surfacing in jagged pieces, until my father made one last desperate move, reaching for me again, insisting we were leaving, insisting this was over, and something inside me locked into place, because I realized that if I went now, if I let him steer me back into silence, this would repeat itself in different forms for the rest of my life. I stepped back, away from his outstretched hand, and said no, not loudly, not dramatically, but firmly enough that the word carried weight, and the room froze around it like time had stumbled. I said I wanted answers, not versions, not edited histories, and I wanted them without threats or ultimatums, and if they couldn't give me that, then I would decide what came next on my own terms. My father stared at me like he was seeing a stranger. My mother wept quietly into her hands, and Marco closed his eyes for a brief moment, as if acknowledging that this was the turning point he'd always known would come, and when he opened them again, there was no triumph there, only relief mixed with sorrow. Outside, a siren wailed somewhere distant, ordinary life continuing without regard for the line my family had just crossed, and I understood with a strange calm that nothing would ever snap back into place after this, because the truth had been spoken aloud, and once it breathes, it doesn't go back into hiding. The days that followed didn't end in shouting matches or slammed doors the way I'd imagined they might, and that was somehow harder because silence returned. But it was different now, heavier, aware of itself, and every room in our house felt like it had learned a secret it couldn't unlearn. My parents didn't forbid me from seeing Marco anymore, not because they approved, but because the authority to forbid had quietly drained out of them, leaving behind something uncertain and fragile. And when my father spoke to me, he chose his words the way people do when they know they're no longer believed by default. My mother avoided my eyes at first, then tried too hard to meet them, apologizing in careful pieces, explaining her fear again and again, as if repetition could turn it into justification, and I listened, not because I forgave her easily, but because I needed to understand the shape of the love that had built and broken our family at the same time. I went back to Marco's house on my own terms, in daylight, without drama, and we talked the way people do when they know there's no neat ending waiting, only honesty and boundaries and time, and he never asked me to call him anything, never tried to fill a role that wasn't his, because he understood something my parents were still learning, that being present doesn't mean possessing. He showed me old photographs of my mother when she was younger, laughing in ways I'd never seen, and he told me stories that weren't designed to win me over, just to give me context. And when I asked him the question that had been circling my thoughts since the letter, the one about whether he thought he might be my biological father, he didn't answer quickly or emotionally. He just said that biology matters less than choice, and that the man who raises a child carries a responsibility no blood test can grant or revoke. The honesty in that answer stayed with me longer than certainty ever could have. Life didn't collapse or magically improve after the truth came out, which might have disappointed someone looking for justice or punishment. But for me, the change was quieter and deeper, because the fear that had lived in my chest since childhood loosened its grip, replaced by something steadier, something like agency. I stopped crossing the street to avoid Marco's fence, and my parents stopped pretending they didn't know why, and the neighborhood gossip flared and faded the way it always does, feeding briefly on half-truths before finding something newer and easier to chew on. Sometimes I caught my father watching me with a look I couldn't fully name, not anger, not regret alone, but something like the dawning realization that love doesn't grant ownership over another person's understanding of their own life. On my 16th birthday, my mother gave me the letter back, neatly pressed, tucked into a new envelope, and told me it was mine now, not as a burden, but as a reminder that fear and love can coexist, and that choosing one doesn't erase the consequences of the other. I didn't know yet what I would do with all of it, with the knowledge, the fractures, the complicated loyalties, but I knew this much with certainty, that the dangerous man I'd been warned about wasn't the one behind the quiet door next door, and that danger often wears the mask of protection when adults are too afraid to tell the truth. Sometimes, late in the evening, I sit on the front steps and watch the lights come on one by one down the street, and I think about how close I came to living my entire life shaped by a lie that wasn't meant to harm me, only to control the fear of others, and I wonder how many doors stay closed simply because no one dares to knock. I don't have all the answers yet, and maybe I never will, but I know who I am now isn't defined by silence or warning glances or inherited fear, and whatever choices I make next will be mine, informed, imperfect, and honest, which feels like the only kind of safety worth believing in.